Hello, everyone. We're going to get started right here on time. I want to welcome you all to More Than a Bomb, the past and present impacts of nuclear weapons, a panel hosted by Global Zero, the international movement for the abolition of nuclear weapons. For the next hour, we're going to be talking about the intersections of nuclear war, climate change, and other important social justice and progressive movements. And the last week, we've seen numerous amounts of nuclear news, whether we're talking about President Trump's Mar-a-Lago raid when they were looking for nuclear documents, the 2015 Iran deal still being in limbo, or Russia continuing shelling at a nuclear power plant in Ukraine as the threat continues around a potential nuclear accident. Needless to say, there is a lot to discuss. Before we get too deep in conversation, I want to acknowledge that we are on the ancestral lands of many indigenous peoples, including the Seneca Nation and the members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. I want to thank all of you for joining us live here in person and send an incredibly special thank you to those joining virtually. We are humbled and honored to be live streaming today. If you like what you hear, please make sure to follow us on Twitter and tweet at Global Zero. We have an amazing panel for you, so let's get started with these introductions. I'm your moderator, Mari Faines, partner for mobilization at Global Zero. For those of you who aren't familiar, and as I said earlier, we are the international movement for the abolition of nuclear weapons. We simply envision a world without nuclear weapons, but we are also thinking about the possibility of what the world looks like beyond the bomb. And we are spearheading an audacious campaign to get there. Hopefully you've seen some of my colleagues around, so please make sure you talk to them when you do. Now let's meet our wonderful panelists. First, we are absolutely thrilled to have Congresswoman Katie Porter representing California's 45th District. As many of you have probably seen, Congresswoman Porter has developed a reputation for her use of visual aids in congressional hearing, particularly a whiteboard. In her roles on both the House Committee on Oversight and Reform and the House Committee on National Resources, the Congresswoman is deeply committed to holding those in power accountable, whether they're polluters or bank CEOs. The Congresswoman has been incredibly vocal in the nuclear weapons complex and has been quoted as saying, "We ought to be concerned about the waste, fraud, and abuse that we allow to go on in our nuclear weapons complex." She's also played a pivotal role in nuclear justice and has requested a formal apology from the United States for the legacy of nuclear testing in the Marshall Islands, which I know she'll touch upon later. Next, we are joined by Iman Awad, Deputy Director at Engage, an organization focused on educating, engaging, and empowering Muslim American communities. There, she works on protecting global human rights and improving domestic policies for Muslim Americans. She'll be here to provide an often overlooked intersection between nuclear weapons and the importance of human-centered foreign policy and national security. Finally, we have Samantha Miller, an activist currently based in Shoshone-Bannock land in the southeastern Idaho. Sam brings an anti-imperialist and decolonization lens to her social justice work. A current intern with Global Zero, she aims to inspire new activists in Colorado, Montana, Nebraska, North Dakota, and Wyoming, all under direct nuclear threat as they're considered sponge states, which you're more than welcome to ask her about later. She also seeks to expand the movement for justice for the victims of nuclear testing. Thank you all so much for being here with us. Representative Porter, I want to start with you. As we said earlier, there have been numerous nuclear incidents in the past few months. How are you talking about this with your constituents?
Thank you very much for asking, and thank you for having me here. Look, I think families across this country, but in my district, particularly value safety. And as we're having a lot of dialogue about public safety and about safety and risk, I think nuclear issues have to be part of that because it's hard to come up with something that makes us less safe than the prospect of a nuclear war. And so, look, I live in Irvine. I always say nobody moves to Irvine for the nightlife. Nothing here is open much past 8 o'clock, not even the Target. People move here for the quality of life, and part of that is safety. So I think families need to understand that authoritarianism and instability abroad is not somebody else's problem. It's our problem, because one of the things with nuclear weapons is that we're all put at risk by the potential. A nuclear war elsewhere is a nuclear harm here. And so I think too many policymakers in Washington are designing policies kind of to serve the interests of defense contractors. I think that anti-corruption angle is also a great way to talk about this with constituents. We need to put first the needs of our community, and our communities need to be safe. As I said, the entire planet would suffer if there were a nuclear incident. And as you know, just a few days ago, researchers showed that not only would nuclear war kill millions immediately, it would cause global crop failures. In a worst case scenario, 5 billion people on the brink of death. So I think helping people kind of understand that what happens overseas is going to happen here. That is the nature of nuclear threats. And I think that is a way to engage them. I will say I find the biggest challenge as the representative here and representing both even numbers of Democrats and Republicans is simply I don't get asked about this as much as I think I should. I don't think people bring this topic up, partly because there are so many immediate and daily threats in their lives. And so I think helping them see that if you're worried about climate change and the destruction of our planet, boy, let me tell you about destruction of our planet and what that would mean with nuclear weapons. And so I think there are ways to link these issues to other issues that maybe do come up more often in town halls so that representatives can be talking about them more regularly.
That's a wonderful point. And you started to talk about this being a safety and a security issue and how it affects your constituents. But how has this affected policymaking? When we think about defense and government, especially when we think about spending priorities, how has this moment changed the conversation?
Well, when it comes to defense spending, I think we need to help our constituents understand a distinction that lobbyists know all too well, which is between what generals want, or more importantly, what defense contractors have on their wish list, and what troops actually need. And too many of our defense dollars go to line the pocket of big defense contractors. That's true not just with regard to nuclear, it's true with regard to all kinds of parts and procurement situation. This is really, really bad for taxpayers, but it's also, this waste and abuse makes us all less safe. So, I'll give an example. Instead of clamping down on the systemic waste and mismanagement, with regard to our nuclear program, we've actually been doing the opposite. So on the way out the door, the Trump administration started funding an intercontinental ballistic missile, ICBM, replacement that we do not need for another couple decades. By buying it now, we're getting some companies immediate profits, but we're putting huge pressure on the rest of our defense budget in a time when inflation is already pushing up the costs of government programs, including the costs of some of our military programs. I really, honestly, and I spend a lot of my time dealing with waste, fraud, and abuse, and I thought I'd kind of seen it all, and then I took a look under the hood at the nuclear program, and it's shocking. The waste and fraud and abuse we allow to go on should be a concern for everybody. The Congressional Budget Office says nuclear weapons programs are going to be $62 billion over budget in the next 10 years. The GAO says the Air Force hasn't even done the math on what it will cost to put new intercontinental ballistic missiles into our old ICBM silos. That's crazy. You need to know what something is going to cost before you come ask us for the money. So even if you take the rationale for ICBMs and the traditional triad at its face value, even if you think there is no price too high for national defense, you should still be outraged that our government is spending $260 billion for missiles we do not need to keep us safe at a price way higher than advertised. Every member on both sides of the aisle should be united in rethinking our spending and nuclear policy for those reasons.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman Porter, and I honestly could not agree more. On the topic of defense, Iman, I want to bring you in here. We're so glad to have you, especially because your community is often so overlooked in the conversation around national security and these larger issues. I want to talk about what are some of the things that have been striking about this crisis in Ukraine, especially as you think about other regional conflicts, i.e. Syria and others, with Engage working on national security and foreign policy, particularly as they pertain to the Middle East, North Africa, Black and Brown and Indigenous communities. How has your work particularly been affected, and what has the resurgence of the nuclear weapons conversation done to your community?
Thank you, Mari. Our community, I represent Muslim Americans. I am a proud daughter of an Egyptian immigrant. We are the topic of national security, but as perpetrators, not victims. And I want to emphasize that we cannot compare and contrast tragedies. Armed conflict, no matter where it happens, has devastating consequences, and it really puts many innocent lives in danger. With that, though, we have an obligation to address the atrocities regardless of where they occur. It was sad, but not unexpected, to see the double standard when it came to the armed invasion of Russia into the Ukraine, in comparison to what has happened in Syria, the evacuation of Afghanistan, the ongoing conflicts in sub-Saharan Africa, specifically Sudan, the Congo, Ethiopia, many of which get little attention here in the US, let alone on the global conversation. The Congresswoman was talking about spending, and just last month, for example, there could have been a legislative fix for Afghans who fled unspeakable violence. The Biden administration had asked Congress to pass the Afghan Adjustment Act, which would streamline the process for Afghans to get legal status. However, Congress left that provision out of the Ukraine funding bill because, and I quote, Republicans claimed that Afghans need more vetting. The double standard couldn't be clearer. When we talk about nuclear powers, especially in our community in the Muslim American space, one threat that continues to come up has been the rise of Islamophobia in India, a nuclear power, the tensions within Kashmir against Pakistan, a nuclear power. And the question we continue to face is, how do we hold nuclear-armed allies accountable for these human rights abuses? How does the United States mitigate our relationship and strategic interests in India while also condemning its ongoing escalation of violence against Muslims, let alone to mention their concerning relationship growing with China? I have other examples, but I'd like to pause here.
Thank you so much, and I'm sure we will come back to those other examples. We at Global Zero recognize that there's a fundamental intersections between all of these issues when you look across the global color line, particularly looking at the ways that the military intersects with so many other systems of injustice and inequity. And I want to take a moment right now to dig into that deeper. Sam, I want to bring you in here. You're a youth activist. You've been working towards the abolition of nuclear weapons, previously with Beyond the Bomb, and now with Global Zero. We've seen that current youth activists recognize that there's a multitude of existential threats affecting them, including the nuclear threat, but also climate change, access to reproductive rights and healthcare, racial justice, and even economic justice. How has your work here at GC tied all of these issues together?
Thank you, Mari. So the issues of nuclear weapons themselves intersect with a lot of other progressive movements, and the actions that Global Zero takes reflect those intersections, starting with the fact that our team is so incredibly diverse because historically, the nuclear sphere has been predominantly white men. And women and people of color have been burdened disproportionately by production and testing and the existence of nuclear weapons. The things that we advocate for have implications for many issues. For example, we've been talking about spending a lot. When we cut spending, we suddenly have funds for healthcare and public education and addressing food insecurity and combating climate change. We're moving to expand the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, so we would have compensation for the communities that have been test sites, including, we want to include places like the Marshall Islands in the Pacific Islands, which is a necessary component for racial justice.
That's absolutely true. And you know, you have the opportunity with all the work that you're doing, being out in the communities to talk with an abundance of different people. What has been most striking to you about this movement and this crisis as people talk about these weapons?
It's striking to me how little people actually know about nuclear weapons. I find that I'm often the first person to tell people that the president has sole authority over the launch of nuclear weapons, so they can just make that decision by themselves. And people don't necessarily have a concept of the threat level that exists with other nuclear armed countries, because whereas they have hundreds of nuclear weapons, the United States has thousands, which isn't to say that it wouldn't be bad if they did something. But there's also a lot of agreement across the political spectrum about the fact that nuclear weapons are bad, and we should have no first use and end sole authority and abolish them altogether, because even with people who might have the opposite opinion of mine on something else progressive, we can all agree that the present power structures are unsustainable, and the risk that nuclear weapons put us all at are too high.
Thank you so much, Sam. You actually mentioned something that I want to circle back with Representative Porter on. I want to turn back to the Marshall Islands. We've always noted that there is a global nexus between climate change, health impact, colonial legacy, and supremacist systems and nuclear weapons, and that disproportionately affects frontline and indigenous communities and the devastating experiences of the humanitarian impacts at the intersections of these issues. Congresswoman, you've been incredibly vocal, including with Senators Hirono and Markey, about apologizing for the U.S. nuclear legacy in places like the Marshall Islands. Can you speak a little bit more to the legacy and the work that's being done on these issues?
Yeah, I mean, just picking up on what Sam said, most people don't know this story. This is part of our history, part of our decision making, part of our historic national defense strategy that most people don't know. And I'll be honest with this panel, I didn't know until I read some articles about it, and I was immediately struck with how important it was for our government to repair as much as one ever can some of the harm, at least to acknowledge the harm that we've done. So from 1946 to 1958, the United States conducted 67 nuclear weapons tests over the Marshall Islands. And the yield on those tests works out to about 1.6 Hiroshima-sized bombs every day for 12 years. Children on the islands thought that the nuclear fallout was snow. Some Marshallese babies were born after the tests with transparent skin and no bones. They're called jellyfish babies. The US still hasn't told the Marshallese everything that we know about the harm from those tests, even though we never admitted to date any wrongdoing. We promised the Marshallese people access to Medicaid as unofficial compensation for the tests. A drafting error in a 1995 bill took that away, and it took 15 years for Congress to fix it. And I just want to credit Senator Hirono for finally getting it done last year. I think everyone should be outraged by our failure to keep our promises to the Marshallese people, but it's particularly important to me as a member of Congress from Orange County and a member of the Natural Resources Committee. We are home to one of the oldest Marshallese communities in the country, and the Natural Resources Committee has jurisdiction over the U.S. programs in the Marshall Islands. So since 2012, Congress has required the Department of Energy to conduct groundwater monitoring at Runit Dome, which is on Inuatak Atoll. And basically it's a big cement container holding nuclear waste. It looks like a humongous garbage can kind of embedded in the atoll. And the Department of Interior provides funding and is supposed to be doing oversight of the Department of Energy's monitoring of leakage of radioactivity of waste at the dome. DOE has not been complying with this groundwater monitoring requirement. And that's where my subcommittee came in. As chair of the Oversight Investigation Subcommittee for Natural Resources, we had a hearing on our nuclear legacy in the Marshall Islands. Was delighted and proud that it was a very bipartisan hearing. And what we tried to do was understand why we're seeing every different government department, from state to interior to energy, kind of point fingers at each other for why this wasn't happening. It became clear that our Department of State needed stronger leadership with regard to rebuilding and maintaining our relationship with the Marshall Islands. So I am thrilled, as a result of some of this pressure and President Biden's leadership, he named Ambassador Joseph Yoon as special presidential envoy for the compact negotiations, our future relationship with the Marshallese people. I think Ambassador Yoon understands the nuclear issue, and I'm hopeful that the resolution to apologize for the harm done by U.S. nuclear testing in the Marshall Islands will move forward, and that will set up a future relationship with the Marshallese people that acknowledges both our past and our future obligations to continue to do this work. I was honored to have Secretary Haaland of the Interior in Orange County yesterday, and when we sat down to have lunch together, this was the very first issue I brought up to her, is making sure that when our Interior Department is giving funding to energy to do this monitoring, that it's actually happening. So there's an ongoing oversight issue here, as well as one of historical acknowledgement and repair.
Thank you so much, Representative Porter. And I think it's incredibly important that we acknowledge these communities that we've affected. We have so much work that needs to be done for these impacted communities. And that is exactly what I want to talk about with you, Iman, talking about legacy and community building. You started talking about it briefly earlier, about how this affects the Muslim, MENA, Black, Indigenous. We can continue the litany of names of people that are continually disenfranchised, and how we recognize that safety and security is not a monolith for each of these communities, and they impact them differently. What are some of the key intersections that you all are working at Engage to reimagine what global security could look like?
Thank you, Mari. In order to authentically reimagine global security, we have to reimagine what our agencies even look like. Is there representation from impacted communities who are speaking on the complexities of these issues? Are we as a global power addressing this in an equitable way? We cannot perpetuate these double standards by not acknowledging our own gaps in representation. Our work in foreign policy intersects with large groups like Human Rights First, Global Witness, International Rescue Committee, but also includes grassroots organizations and civil society groups like the Campaign for Uyghurs, the International Campaign for the Rohingyas, and institutions focused on specific issues, even domestically, with Black Lives Matter, Southern Poverty Law Center, and countless others. I mentioned the domestic issues and the domestic organizations because we cannot reimagine that global security again or protect human rights abroad when our own backyard is facing mounting challenges as well. At this point, too, we can't implement security policies off of the backs and negative impacts it's had historically on Black, Brown, Muslim, and other minority communities. Patriot Act, NCERS, we were putting civil liberties behind our national security, and we still feel those ramifications today. As we move forward, we have to uphold our collective impact and work with those people that are directly affected, because those closest to the issue are closest to the solution. And through the organizations that I've mentioned, we have a common thread that we all want a just and secure future, but we want it in an equitable way, and to acknowledge what has happened in the past and learn those lessons.
Thank you so much. I think it's really important that we talk about the conversations about communities, particularly here in America, and how we make them so secure, recognizing that there's vast imperfections in our systems. We've already talked about the ways in which militarism in the nuclear weapons complex highlights some of these things, or what we considered essential in keeping us safe. We at Global Zero refute that premise. We recognize that these issues need to be changed. That's why we work towards abolition and reimagining what safety and security should look like for generations to come. I know I just allowed Iman the opportunity to talk about what reimagining security could look like, but Sam, as well as Representative Porter, I know you both have thoughts on what this potentially could be. I want to start with you, Sam. What does a world without nuclear weapons look like for you? And what are some of the things that Global Zero has taught you as you work towards that goal?
To me, a world without nuclear weapons means a world where the 2018 Hawaii missile alert that was a false alert won't happen again, and the people that I love don't have to go through something super traumatic and they have to move past it like nothing happened. It means that people who have been displaced can go back home to their native lands, hopefully, and their descendants won't have to know the struggles that their ancestors went through. It means that there wouldn't be a drunk president who's having an existential crisis that feels empowered to end the world as we know it. And it means that biodiversity would be protected because we wouldn't necessarily have mass areas wiped out in minutes. But Global Zero has helped me reimagine how we think about security, in that I no longer feel like it's naive to imagine security in any way other than what we have it as currently. And I can make a difference intersectionally by working on this issue, and I don't have to feel like I'm abandoning the other issues that I care about, because intersectionality is so important to this movement.
Love that. Before I pose the question to you, Representative Porter, I want to let the audience know that after her response, we're going to be taking questions from the audience. So now is the moment to start thinking about what you might want to ask these wonderful panelists. But Representative Porter, you've always been deeply invested in creating more stable and safe communities. You alluded to it earlier, some of the ways in which we can rethink what our country looks like. I know the Ukraine crisis has affected policymaking, but you've been very vocal in the past about the reallocation of funds, particularly from nuclear weapons in the military complex, and reinvesting in social cares like healthcare, education, infrastructure. We applaud that thinking. Can you speak a bit more about the ways that the government could better serve communities?
Yeah, look, I think we have to recognize that national security at its heart is about service to our communities. It's about allowing our communities to thrive because they are safe. And if communities are having other needs that are not met, whether those are health needs, whether those are dealing with pollution, whether those are other social needs, those are lots of ways to be unsafe or unwell. And so I think there's often this big divide in Washington, driven in part by the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, in which things get bucketed. You're either a national security thing because you're in the NDAA, in which you're going to become law and we can add it on, and sure, we can plus that up, and you're not. And if you're not, then you have to find a vehicle to get done. You have to scrap for every dollar. There's an endless negotiation kind of downward. And I think that really misses a huge opportunity to understand how these issues connect. And we're seeing this in lots of ways right now. For example, a failure to invest in public health, in initiatives to have people have better access to healthy food and making healthy food affordable, investing in public recreation, investing in PE, is driving difficulty in recruiting members to serve in our armed forces who can meet the physical demands of the job. That's just one example. So when you look at sort of like, what does the Agriculture Committee have to do with national defense? What does public health and public food programs have to do with national defense? It has to do with military readiness of our personnel, for example. And that's just one example I would give. So I think the siloing is a big problem. I think we need to make sure, too, that our people who serve on our Armed Services Committee, on our Foreign Affairs Committee, reflect the full diversity of life experiences and the intersectionality of our caucus. And I think we've had historically, people have gone to committees where they're comfortable. And that has meant that people who have been in the armed services serve on the Armed Services Committee. I want to emphasize that those voices are important. Having veterans and people who have been on the front lines or led men and women into battle on our Armed Services Committee is important. But it's also important to have others who have had different experiences and have different legacies, who have been refugees because of military action abroad, for example, hearing those voices. So I think that those connections are important. I think there are people who have worked historically. I would identify Jackie Spear, for example, a retiring member who has worked to connect the Me Too movement broadly with the sexual assault crisis in our military, as somebody who has drawn those lines and made those connections, the lack of justice for workers and workplaces generally, with the lack of justice for people in the military who are sexually assaulted. But I think there's a lot more that we can do in that regard.
Thank you so much, Representative Porter, for providing a few of those examples. With that, we are prepared for audience questions. Our team member has the microphone. If you have questions, feel free to raise your hand and they will bring the mic over. Please note whether you will be asking it to each one of our panelists or an individual, and try and keep it concise so that we can make sure that our panelists get an ample time to answer each one of your questions.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay, wonderful. I yell in these, so I try not to. So this question is really for anyone who'd like to answer it, which is vague, but I know for myself, like I'm running for library board in Ann Arbor, like there's a lot of like small government stuff, and this issue can seem so big and far away. But how can I, like as somebody like on those smaller boards or like a city council member or something like that, like how can I advocate for this safety and, like getting rid of nuclear arms and stuff in my community is kind of the question.
Representative Porter, do you want to tackle that first?
Yeah, I can definitely start. I'd like to hear what others have to say, because I think there's a good connection here to what we've talked about. I mean, you could go back to where I started, which is about safety, but I think there's also a question about government working as intended and holding government to account. That's really important. So when you think about something like a library board and making sure that we're creating library spaces that are inclusive, that acknowledge, for instance, the need to protect our constitutional duties, there's analogies to doing that same kind of oversight and government accountability work at every aspect of government. So I think a lot of this for me is about being willing to hold the United States government internationally to keeping our promises, whether that's to the Marshallese people for Medicaid, whether that is thinking about what it means that we pulled out of a nuclear deal that was a global nuclear deal with Iran, and now having to try to figure out where we go from that. And so I think showing that you're willing to sort of question longstanding practices that maybe were developed 40 and 50 years ago, when we did not have the understanding that we should have today about the consequences of policy. But I will just echo to you, I share, even as a congressional representative, at the federal level, I have talked about and just did mention, it can feel difficult sometimes to bring these issues home to people. So I think the accountability is a great way to do this.
Thank you so much. Iman or Sam, would like to grab this?
Yeah, and first at the top, I just want to thank the library for getting me through quarantine. You guys had that awesome Libby app. If you don't have it, download it. It has every single ebook you could ever want. But I don't think any conversation is too small. Our location is in Washington, D.C., and we go to Capitol Hill often talking about numerous issues, turning blue in the face. But it's really you that holds the power because you're in that district. You speak to the people. And not only that, the library is a resource for folks to get internet access, to access a computer, to reach out to their elected officials. So I think in those ways, understanding that it may seem at times that DC actually holds some of the tools to get things done, it will always and it will continuously remain to be a hyper-local issue. So just being available, sharing the resources, and having those conversations so people know what needs to be brought up, because you are a voter, you have a right to hold your elected officials accountable, I think is where to start.
Just to quickly piggyback off of what Iman said, sorry, I lost my train of thought. I'm not from this time zone. Oh yeah, so like the idea or talking about nuclear weapons is such a unapproachable conversation so much of the time, and you have to make that information accessible. And being in the library, like Iman said, you are the resource, and just having that conversation can go so far.
Wonderful. And I would say simply reach out to organizations like ours. We'll help you get started at a local level. Questions from anybody else?
So I tend to work on the production side of things as it pertains to different messages. And the question that I have is, what would be the ideal tone for some sort of video project in which to get the message out in regards to stopping nuclear bombs? Like, would you want to go for a more like a sympathetic tone, or would you want to go for more like a hard-on, okay, guys, stop making these things, or like what tone do you think is most effective in really getting that message out? And that goes for anybody who wants to answer that.
I have thoughts, but I'm going to defer to the panel. Rep. Porter, do you want to talk about a little bit more about how you've been talking to your constituents, or any ways that you've been doing it positively?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's going to depend a little bit on who you are, but answering with regard to you, I think there is a real need to highlight the voices of those who have been affected and their families and their communities. So, my own engagement in this issue came from incredible reporting that was done by the LA Times, including photos and lifting up the voices of the Marshallese people. So I think helping, some of these areas were chosen because they are rural. They're chosen because they are disadvantaged. They're chosen because the people who will experience the harms do not have the same level and have not had the same level of access to media and to political power. And so I think lifting up those voices directly is a really important part of what you can do. And I think that's consistent with both what Sam and Iman have been saying.
Yeah, I fully agree with the Congresswoman, and I think it's imperative to center the voices of people impacted by this. You've unlocked a core memory in college. We never learned the true history of what the U.S. legacy is around the world. And I remember watching a movie in a political science class called White Flash, Black Rain, which was about the effects of nuclear bombs. It has been over a decade, and I can still visualize what I watched and remember the stories of the individuals, the face of the man they interviewed who forever, his skin has been burned, and he can't live a full life. So I think it's important to talk to the victims, to talk to the people who are impacted, and allow them to really drive what their tone is so people understand the full effects.
And in addition to centering impacted communities and their narrative, I think that narratives around this conversation need to have like a hopeful tone and really talk about the possibility of a world beyond nuclear weapons and provide tangible steps that people can take so that they feel empowered to have agency in this issue.
Absolutely. Do we have any further questions?
Well, this is kind of a depressing thought, but we've seen newscasts that say that if a stray missile hits the nuclear plant in Ukraine, I don't know if it would be a local effect, more or less, or if it could be a worldwide disaster. Any opinions?
I'm going to continue with the order. Rep. Porter, do you want to comment on the conversations that you all have been having?
I mean, I think regardless, let's separate out two kinds of effects. That there may be the direct effects on a community, which we would all hope would be as small as possible, although it would be significant. But there's also what that means to kind of revitalizing nuclear fears and kind of channeling a lot of renewed energy into investing in a weapon system that actually makes us less safe. And so I think that is one of the things I worry about, is not just what might happen in Ukraine, but how a nuclear incident of any kind, when we're talking about nuclear codes and not being safe, all of these things. But when we feel the threat, if there is a nuclear incident or accident, sometimes we have seen that move us closer to safety with with anti-proliferation, with better safeguards, better accountability. Sometimes when there has been a nuclear risk, it has gone the other direction. And I think with regard to Putin and Russia, there's a real concern that where we are in Ukraine and the risks that are being created in Ukraine is being used to kind of reinvigorate a nuclear movement that I think ultimately makes the world less safe.
I'm going to jump in here and piggyback off that question and talk a little bit to Iman about the foreign policy implications of this. We talked first, I know Rep. Porter has been ample about having a diplomacy first policy. That's something that has seemed to be a way forward. As you were all thinking about What does that look like? You talked earlier about the human side of this policy. How have questions like that and engaging on the fear that people have, how do you talk about changing foreign policy around these issues?
Yeah, I mean, that's a loaded question. I think that especially working in the MENA space, there's always a lot of tragedy, a lot of very heavy topics, a lot of threats of violence. With that, though, we're looking at the Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa. These are not nuclear-powered continents. That's not a threat that they necessarily face. Syria is housing some of the nuclear weapons from Putin, but it's important to recognize the legacy that nuclear weapons can have. I'm not saying that's a threat that our communities overseas are facing, but this is a very real threat to the Ukrainians. And we know that legacy. We know what happened when we dropped a bomb. And the question remains, are we going to choose to learn lessons from that? Or are we going to choose to repeat history? I don't think it's a question that we can't turn a blind eye. It's not we wonder what's going to happen. We know. We know what's going to happen, and we know the human impact.
That's absolutely correct. And I actually want to turn back to Sam. You talked a little bit when you were reimagining what safety and security look like beyond the bomb about your own personal effects to the Hawaii test. You have family that fundamentally understands what this fear that he's describing is. Do you want to talk a little bit about what that looks like?
How do you want me to talk about it?
However you see fit. You can tell us how it affected them, what did that impact look like, how you've thought about it since, what is something that's powerful. You know, we talk about, we understand fundamentally what the Ukrainians could be going through, which is what Iman just talked about. You've seen real people live through that moment.
It's interesting because it was a really traumatic event that was over so fast, and there was never any follow-up or processing that happened. And so for me, the biggest takeaway of that whole incident was just why that was acceptable to happen in the first place and how inadequately the fallout was dealt with.
I think, Representative Porter, that brings me back to an earlier point that you made about us understanding legacies of our nuclear testing, of the actions that we take. What would you say, Sam just talked about not having any closure around some of these issues. How do we talk about these legacy and effects? Because people are still feeling for generations and reeling over things like the radiation impacts, the potentials. How do we have those conversations with impacted communities in real time?
I mean, I think that it starts by being willing to look honestly at our past decisions. And I think there is often this mistake that strength comes from kind of being the loudest voice or the only voice, and digging in on historic positions. And I think strength comes from a willingness to listen, and to build bridges and to understand that we all are part of our nation's history, our world's history, and those discussions. So I think we've seen this play out in the Marshall Islands in really important ways, where there have been repeated attempts by the United States to different parts of the federal government to say, that's over. We put that behind us. And the reality is, one of the really reasons that we're also concerned about nuclear testing, nuclear weapons, is it's a very long tail. It's a long tail health-wise. It's a long tail in terms of reshaping people's idea of safety and fear in their communities. It's a long tail environmentally. And so the reality is you cannot understand where the Marshall Islands is today and what their needs and positions are going to be with regard to continuing to be an ally of the United States. They have been a strong ally, despite what they have gone through. If we want to continue that relationship, we need to be a credible ally back. And it's difficult to do that if you're refusing to look honestly. So it is true that at the time the United States dropped those bombs, there was less understanding of the harms than there is today. There was certainly not the understanding of how climate would worsen the nuclear environmental contamination, for example. But it's also true that the United States deceived the Marshallese and said some and did some things that at the time they knew were essentially using the Marshallese as guinea pigs to study the effect of radiation because they were an isolated and indigenous people far from our own borders. And so I think you have to acknowledge that, and that strength comes from that. And I think that's part of a diplomacy first approach, which is understanding that that doing oversight of ourselves, being willing to hold ourselves account, is what gives us that credibility to build alliances going forward.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I want to go to the question in the middle there from the audience.
Thank you so much. I'm loving this panel. Representative Porter, I'm curious, you mentioned the importance of hearing from constituents and grassroots pressure, and I'm curious if there are any committees or specific targets or geographies that where we could helpfully make some noise from what you see.
Yeah, I think one area where I'd like to see increased oversight, I've done this work through the Natural Resources Committee and through the jurisdiction that it has over the insular areas, including the Marshall Islands and those areas. I think our actual oversight committee needs to be more engaged here. Particularly around the cost overruns that are projected that I was talking about with the renewal of the ICBMs, the lack of the Air Force coming up with a number. Part of the reason we have an oversight committee within Congress that is separate from the oversight subcommittees that traditional committees have is because we're concerned that committees will be self-interested in their own bills and programs. So remember, I'm on the overall oversight committee, and then I'm the subcommittee chair of oversight for natural resources. So the reason we have this big oversight committee is we're concerned that maybe the Armed Services Committee or the Foreign Affairs Committee or the Natural Resources Committee won't be willing to go all the way and push all the way. And I think there's some evidence that is in fact true. And so I think that is an important area, is making sure that we are robustly doing that oversight and that we are coming at these issues of national security from the perspective of, we want to be safe. This isn't a trade-off. There's no group of people that I represent anyway, that doesn't want the United States to be safe. But there are different approaches to getting there, and there's different track records of the costs and harms of different approaches to different people, to our land, to our planet. And so I think that, one of the things I would just really encourage people to do is to ask more questions of their representatives about foreign affairs. We've tried to have town halls and things and events on this, and we simply don't get the turnout in some cases that we do when we're talking about healthcare, when we're talking about the climate change. And yet these things are absolutely intertwined.
Thank you so much, Rep. Porter. I actually want to quickly jump in before we go to the final question from the audience. And Iman, you actually have people working on the ground in local areas, going to representatives to ask them about foreign affairs. What are some of the tips and tricks you might be able to give our audience, and how you have those conversations as a constituent going to your reps?
Yeah, first, we love a good oversight committee. It's one of our favorite tools. But it's actually very easy to reach out to your local offices. In fact, I would argue that my local chapters are way more effective than I am in Washington, D.C., because they have a vested interest. They're the people who put these people into their seats. They're the voters. They're the constituents. And I'm sorry if I'm exposing anything, Congresswoman, but I've walked into offices in D.C. where they literally have a whiteboard of which issues have gotten the most conversation today. For example, when we were lobbying on Kashmir, we walked into one office and we saw Kashmir and we saw 10 tally marks. And because I'm pretty shameless, I asked, hey, what are those tally marks? And they told us, these are the calls that we're getting from our constituents. Don't hesitate to reach out. You can call them, you can leave a message. The staffers are fantastic. I think it's also important to recognize and remember that there's humans on the other end of the phone. Some of us live in very complex and difficult areas. I'm speaking to you, Texas. I'm sorry. But it's important to remember the staffers are there to do their job, including some people who have been very hostile to the Muslim community. We have good relationships with their staffers. Have those conversations, engage, keep a positive attitude. Remember, some of these are, college kids that are interning, answering phones. We don't want to be yelling at them, but have your conversations, don't back down. Phone calls, set up meetings, and you can find that information easily online.
Can I just add one thing to that? Because I think it's so great to hear you say that. You're absolutely right. We keep track of what people call about. I get reports about what are the biggest issues that we're hearing about. I read the letters and the things that are going back out to people. So the other tip I would give is I think there's this is a little bit of a tangent, but it's actually a good way to close for this Netroots audience, I think, is there's such a misconception that to be effective in talking to your congressperson, you have to travel to Washington, D.C. and spend all this money and have a lobbyist to help you. That is a bunch of malarkey. Like that is like a self-fulfilling lobbyist, full employment for lobbyist talking point. Use Zoom, ask to meet with a legislative aide, always take the staff meeting as well as the member meeting. I rely on my staff to help teach me about things, but you really can get more time, have a more in-depth conversation, involve more people from your community who maybe can't travel for different reasons if you ask to meet in the district. So I just want to encourage people, if you come to DC, I always say you'll get 10 minutes in a hallway if we're lucky. If you meet with me in my community, I can often give you 30 minutes with my staff and hear from everybody in the community who wants to take part. So that is a little down and dirty tips and tricks on how to really maximize your ability to connect with your member.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman Porter. I want to check if there's a final question from the audience in the back.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you so much for this conversation, doing this at Netroots. It's so important. This has been super interesting. Representative Porter, I'm coming from Los Angeles, so very proud to have you representing SoCal, one of the few really thoughtful, empathetic members. So we're talking a lot about nuclear weapons today, which I think is crucial because that's sort of the existential threat to the future of our species, right? So it's so important to fight against that. But I'm curious for y'all's perspective on conventional weapons. So the U.S., I think, over the past 20 years has dropped something like 350,000 bombs around the world. We drop an average of 46 bombs per day, both in countries that we're at war with and others that we don't even hear about. 4 of the 5 largest weapons manufacturers in the world are based in the U.S., so we literally are exporting these killing machines all over the world. And so, Sam, I loved what you were saying about sort of imagining a future beyond nuclear weapons. And I'm just curious, if y'all are imagining sort of a future beyond weapons, right? Like I've heard this idea that conflict is inevitable, but violence is a choice. So right now that's a choice that we're making as a country. And I'm just curious if you see a possibility for a movement. Obviously the U.S. can't unilaterally demilitarize, right? But a movement for global demilitarization, what would that look like? Just curious for your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll just offer one quick thought. Sorry, Sam, and then can I go to you? Sorry, I didn't mean to do that. It's hard on Zoom. I just want to offer one quick thought, which is I think that the jurisdictional gap between armed services and foreign affairs is part of how we're not bridging this. So we don't connect often choices about foreign aid with choices about our military's role and our military funding and our investment in weapons. And so I think bridging that is one of the ways that we can deal with this. So conflict is inevitable. One of the ways to deal with conflict is providing investment in civil society, investment in programs that improve human development, human conditions, investment in democracy building and anti-corruption initiatives. All of those things reduce the potential that conflict escalates into violence. And when you treat these two things as separate things, and everything is necessary when it comes to national security, but military security assistance and sort of foreign aid assistance is some kind of like nice to have. I think that you miss those connections. So sorry, Sam, back to you.
Noting our time, I'm going to hop in very quickly, and I'm going to let Sam answer that question as well as think about her final thoughts and give them here. And then I'll go to you, Iman, and finally, Representative Porter.
Yeah, just to second what Rep. Porter was saying, it is all connected. So when we are fighting for the abolition of nuclear weapons, those other instances of violence will hopefully also be reduced. But I mean, we are focusing our energy on the specific abolition of nuclear weapons at the moment as an organization. Final thoughts. Thank you all for coming. I know it's a very unapproachable topic oftentimes, so I hope it feels more approachable now. And just know that you don't have to be an expert to be an activist in this sphere. You don't have to be a scientist who knows how to make or dismantle nuclear weapons, because the impacts affect all of us, and you should get a say in the issue.
Thanks, Sam. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Just final thoughts is a huge thank you and just gratitude to Global Zero for having the Muslim Americans be a part of this conversation. As I mentioned at the top, we're often looked at as the perpetrators, not the victims. So I just ask, as we move forward in these spaces, and especially following the last question, we need to remember there have been hundreds, if not thousands, of bombs dropped on Middle Eastern children. These are real lives. Policy's great, but we need to center that there are people, families, kids, mothers, brothers, sisters that are behind these acts.
Representative Porter, I'm going to let you go for final thoughts.
I would just thank the panelists for being part of this conversation and the audience. The single most important thing that I do in my job is learn. And this has been an opportunity not just to share some of the things that I've done, but to learn from each one of you on the panel and in the audience. And to me, that's what Netroots is about. It's about the chance to learn from each other and then take that back into our community. So thank you very much for having me.
With that, I want to say thank you to all of you for joining us here and on the live stream. This has been an incredibly fruitful conversation. We appreciate you being here. If you want to learn more about these issues, Global Zero is around. We're at booth 200. There's swag at the back of the room. And, find us on Twitter and Instagram at Global Zero. We hope that when you walk away from this, you recognize that this is an intersectional issue. This is a systems issue. This is not something solely about the weapons or the foreign policy or the national security. There are humans, there are movements, and we all can only work together to get to a safer, more equitable, and more just world. We appreciate your time, and we hope you have a safe and great rest of the conference. Thank you so much.